Hello and welcome to this video on regulation and state provision. So in this video we're going to look at regulation and state provision, the advantages and disadvantages, and then relate these to solving market failure. So we've seen previously that market failure can arise because of asymmetric or imperfect information when one side of a transaction knows more than another. So governments can often try and balance this up. They can try and provide information to the public or to an industry so that they know as much as each other and we can have a more effective market transaction. If the government provides information to consumers, they might do so to try and correct the problem of information gaps. Examples would include things like road safety campaigns, food safety campaigns, and public health advice and guidelines. Governments may also pass regulations, and this is where they use the law to enforce things, to enforce consumers or producers to behave in a certain way that addresses problems associated with public goods or negative externalities. So they might make a legal compulsion, make it legally necessary to abide by a certain regulation so that market failure is avoided. So for example, they might have direct controls on price for certain businesses. They might say you can only raise your prices by a certain amount to stop them exploiting customers who have to buy it. They could set minimum standards for quality or maybe for environmental regulations. They can enforce these through law, and effectively they can make demand more price inelastic for certain things like car insurance. So here are some examples of government regulations. So environmental standards to do with the level of waste or packaging, hazardous substance emissions. The government might produce a regulation that reduces the negative externality associated with damaging the environment. Things like age restrictions. These are examples of government regulations trying to undo any harmful negative external effects. Making people or businesses require licenses in order to operate can be an example of a government regulation. Making certain things compulsory, like car insurance or paying tax or health and safety equipment, again can help reduce some of the market failure outcomes. Sometimes the government regulate industries. So for example, the water industry, the power industry, and gambling, casinos industries, they might pass laws about maybe how much they can charge for water or how much they can charge for energy or how much someone is allowed to bet in a particular day. And they do this to try and address some of the negative externalities or some of the potential for the market not to function very well. What are the advantages and disadvantages of government regulations? Well, some of the advantages, typically if it's just a law that is passed, it doesn't require taxpayers' money. It's very simple to understand. This is the law, and to a certain extent consumers can still shop around. Some disadvantages, often by imposing you to buy something, it can have a cost, particularly negatively on low-income groups. Of course, regulations can just be ignored. Sometimes regulations incur extra costs for firms to ensure they're compliant. There's also the cost of monitoring. How did the government know that the producer or the consumer are actually following these regulations? Sometimes it can be difficult to value the effects that a regulation are having or what the limit should be. For example, how much should someone gamble in a day? Okay, now we're moving on to what's known as state or government provision. And this is when the government provide a service directly themselves, funded through tax revenue. So this is associated with solving the problem of public goods. So these would be examples: defence, the army, the justice system, police, to a certain extent healthcare and education. The government take tax revenues, and to avoid the problem of free riders, they provide the service directly themselves, so no one is really paying in the normal sense of a market transaction. For example, flood systems. So, state or government provision is good because the government can have very close control over how much is provided. You don't get this problem of too little being produced by the free market. Effectively, you're eliminating the free rider problem. Disadvantages, well, often the government may be more inefficient in providing the service than perhaps the private sector would be. There's no real incentive for governments to be efficient, to cut costs, as whatever the cost is, they just charge it in tax to the taxpayer. The amount provided may not exactly reflect society's wants, as output is not determined through the market mechanism. So how big, we know that government should provide the army, but how big should the army be? What is the best from society's point of view? Without the interaction of demand and supply, it'd just be the government's call on what they think the socially optimal level is. So in this video, we've looked at government regulation and state provision and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each approach and how these approaches correct different types of market failure. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.